I mean, first of all, it's just nice to meet. There's very few podcasting DJs out there. So despite the fact that we've never met and all of that, I feel a certain kinship because there's only less than 10 of us probably, right?
Right. Sure. Yeah. I mean, well, I've said before that I think there's like potential for it to be like almost like the comedians podcasting like ecosystem.
Yes.
And it would be good if there were more of them, right? So, I mean, I think they would be self-supporting as well, like self-reinforcing. I think like it's not a zero-sum game at all. It's not competition. It's like I think the more of this stuff, the better, actually. So, yeah, I would encourage more people to do it.
Yeah, man, I completely agree. And let me ask you, just as a podcast nerd question off the top, because I feel the same as you. I was like, why aren't more people doing this? I'm a huge podcast listener myself, which was the inspiration to start doing it with all the interesting, weird people that we know in music. And for me, do you think there's an appetite for discussion of like what we're talking about? Because sometimes I'll talk to other DJs and it's almost like a new concept, other producers that like they're surprised that people would even want to hear them talk about this stuff. You know what I mean? Yeah.
I mean, the format, I think because of that, like the format of your average DJ podcast episode tends to be it's almost like a profile interview type thing. And I think it would be, if there was more of them and it was more of a kind of circuit, it would become, I think, more like, well, like I said, more like the comedy, the way the comedy ones have developed, where they're just basically people talking. And oftentimes it's, quite trivial what gets discussed. And I suppose comedy maybe lends itself slightly better to that sort of thing. But, I think people are like, I think people like the long-term, lots of the long-form format just generally. I think people like listening to people talk about stuff, and they like people listening to people who they, are fans of, just at a kind of really, base level. So I think it would, I definitely think there's room for more, and there's room for it to develop into much more of a thing which is just a kind of a fixture on the calendar. It's just something that people just do. I think there is definitely room for that for sure. But I mean, you're right. Like, people are quite often, musicians are quite guarded about what they say. Yeah. There's quite a lot of sort of message discipline, and people kind of overthink it, I think, to quite a large extent. I think it's slightly out of date, honestly, in the way kind of music fans think about musicians. I think there's much more of an appetite for a kind of more steady stream of, kind of everyday type content. I think the people that come through now who are successful are pretty relentless in, how much of their everyday lives that they share. So I think, sitting down and, having these sorts of conversations, having them public, I think there's nothing wrong with that at all. I mean, I think maybe it wouldn't have worked so well in a previous era, but I think where we are now, it absolutely does.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think, I guess now that we're talking about it, I guess the only difference I see between the comedian situation and what we do is that in music, the air of mystery can still be sort of an asset to some people. And I think some people try to lean into that. But even with that, I've had people on my podcast, and I'm sure you have as well, who I think by the end of it get surprised by how much they like talking even about that aspect of like what they share and what they don't and how they've sort of crafted it. I don't know. I love talking about all this shit, man. It's just fun.
Yeah. I mean, I haven't had someone come on like in character, because I mean,
I've had one masked DJ. I've had one. Right. Okay. Because, and actually, analogous to the kind of comedy ones, you definitely have that in the comedy sphere. I mean, that's obviously much more common, for people to perform explicitly as a character in comedy. But people absolutely do it
in music as well. And like I said, slightly less explicitly, but people have their sort of performance persona, which then transplants into interviews. And, it's often like kind of caricature of who they really are. But then sort of, I guess, exposing that to, a couple of hours is much, it's much more difficult to keep consistency there. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I think that I'm totally up for more of it, put it that way.
Well,
generally.
Oh, absolutely, man. And I love your podcast, by the way. And, I'll do a little intro at the top of this and tell everybody what it is and where to find it and all that. But can you talk about, for you, what was the driving force starting that podcast? What was going on when you made the decision to do it? Because as you and I both know, it's a ton of work. It's a big commitment.
It is. I mean, I just, well, like you, I'm a fan of the format more generally, and I kind of identified as a lack in my own listening, actually, of podcasts of stuff which was directly, related to do what I do for a living. I'm listening to endless kind of like, politics and history and finance and comedy and like, just all this stuff. There's so much great examples, so many great examples of podcasts in all of those areas, and just wasn't that much. I mean, there are some, mostly though, that are directly linked to one of these kind of legacy, media institutions, and in the format of, kind of a traditional sort of press interview. And that's not really what podcasting is, or not the good stuff anyway. So I just figured, fuck it, let's give it a go. I mean, I'd done sufficient market research just by listening to so many. Yeah. I figured, I can do this, maybe. And, you learn obviously along the way, but I mean, I didn't want it to be, well, like I said, it lends itself, the fact there aren't too many of them, and the fact that generally speaking, people who come on are not used to a much more conversational format. It does kind of resolve itself often into kind of profile type interview. That's sort of that's the kind of natural state, I think, for most of the episodes that we've done anyway. But like I said, it's a bit different to being interviewed by a journalist. It's not the same when it's two, I guess, peers talking to each other, even if it is sort of ostensibly in the context of in the format of an interview, and a sort of profile type interview. So, I mean, I like to think that I ask the questions that I would like to be asked, and often aren't asked by, normal journalists. We've got a sort of unofficial ban on music journalists, which I have actually broken, and next week's episode actually is with a journalist. But generally speaking, I feel like the space is not very well served by the press corps. Yeah. So, that was a kind of secondary aim of mine when starting, show these people that it can be done better.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I'm right there with you, man. I mean, for me, part of it was the fact that I thought the level of discourse was so bad. And, I'm more, and this is maybe something we can get into, sort of the divide inside of electronic music. I'm more on the EDM side of things, like American EDM, whatever you want to call it. I came up through that scene. And particularly for that, when I really first got popping, or whatever you want to say, really got it going for me, was in the blog era. And the blog era at the time was incredible. And it was kind of all of these individual, independent journalists, even if we weren't calling them journalists at the time. And that was where all the cool work was being done. And it was where you could go to find all the new, exciting music. And then, the EDM thing happened, and capitalism happened, and it all, all the blogs just basically started trying to sell ad space. The discourse went away. The search for new music went away. All that went away. And it was a vacuum. There was nothing. And it's kind of wild. I would say I've had a couple journalists on, and there's still a few people doing great work, but it's very few and far between at this point.
Yeah, and seemingly the good stuff has moved away from those kind of legacy institutions and onto, places like Substack, which actually is not confined to music journalism at all. I think a lot of the good journalism, just generally speaking, is happening on platforms like that and away from, those big, formerly ubiquitous institutions which have been, largely hollowed out in sort of post... in this century, since the turn of the century, I suppose, for obvious reasons. And, I think now it's basically just the kind of preserve of people from a very specific socioeconomic background who, are coming into it for, reasons which are probably not conducive to them making great journalistic contributions, if I can put it like that.
Yeah, that's a very, very polite way to put it, yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Well, okay. So I do want to talk about you, and I do want to learn more about your background as well, because I think we could sort of talk about these issues forever. But for you, I mean, I guess as long as we're talking about the ways people get into what you do, it's hard, man. I have all these notes, and I've been a fan of yours for a long time. But you've done so many things and you've been in the game for a long time. It's hard to know where to start. But I guess my first question is for you generally. When did dance music enter your life? When did it become something that you realized was important to you?
Okay, so I was a music student from the age of, I guess, 5 or something. So I kind of had it hardwired, sort of baked into my childhood that music was something that should be, I guess, taken seriously and was just part of everyday life to a large extent. But I didn't really fully engage with it until I was able to have guitar lessons. I did all sorts of instrument lessons, which really didn't kind of capture my imagination at all. And it was only when I was like 12 or 13 and was able to pick up a guitar that the whole thing just sort of started to make sense. And I think that was largely because I was able to improvise and jam around in a manner that I was never really able to prior to that. And basically, I think that kind of approach to music is ultimately why I find myself doing what I have been doing, for most of my adult life at this point. So, just to answer your question directly, I started going to clubs when you were able to. So I grew up in London, and you were able to get into clubs with the aid of a fake ID. I guess from the age of like 14 or 15.
And what era of UK clubbing is this? Like, what was going on?
Right.
In the clubs?
I went to my first quote unquote rave in 1995, which is an awful long time ago, unfortunately.
I'm only a couple years ahead of you, so I feel
right. So sure. So it's a long time ago. The good part of that is that it was a good time to be going to clubs. I wish I was 6 years older, probably, and was able to go to today's 89 raves.
Oh, man,
but, 95, I guess it was the kind of tail end of the first bit, I suppose. You could probably look at it like that, so 94, 95, or maybe into the, I guess, second, whatever terminology you want to use. But certainly it was still the original spirit of rave, in massive air quotation marks, was kind of intact. So I was able to get a bit of that direct experience, and it just made a lot of sense to me immediately. Candidly, I was like definitely attracted by the drugs as well. Sure. That was a pretty key driver in my initial uptake of the music.
Wait, Ben, you were not alone in that. Especially I would say no. Like early to mid to late, just the 90s in the UK is sort of a legendary time. I wasn't even there, and I'm well aware of sort of the reputation of, the mix of drugs and music that was going on at the time.
Yeah, we all acknowledge that the music is an American thing, and to a lesser extent a European thing, but the culture I think is largely British, and certainly certainly rave culture absolutely is. And it was a sort of confluence of different factors, of which the music was only one, right? And yes, drugs were a pretty heavy influence too, right? As well as, there were various other things that went into the mix, like, the political situation at the time, and, the nature of who was there, particularly in London. But I mean, as a sort of 15, 16-year-old, this was just, mind blowing, really. I mean, I'm not like, I think, like I said, like, if I'd been born 5-6 years earlier, that whole era, or maybe a bit more than that, 7 or 8 years earlier, maybe, like the real kind of firsthand acid house explosion of the late 80s, I think would have been, and that's something that we've talked about actually directly on my podcast with people who were there. So people like a guy called Gerald and Dave Clark. That I think would have been something different entirely, or something perhaps more profound. But I mean, ultimately, maybe more profound is the wrong word, because it is what you make of it, right? And so you arrive somewhere as an impressionable teenager, and you can't help but be shaped by the experiences you have at that time, right? So I feel extremely lucky to have been able to go to those raves, and like I said, it was immediately caught my imagination. Going back to what I was saying about playing the guitar, I had been in bands previous to that, so I was making music and writing songs, and was already quite ambitious, I think, musically, or certainly to the extent that I saw it as a potential thing that I could do with the rest of my life, just music as a kind of general thing.
Does that come from family? Because you had said that you sort of learned early on that this was something to be taken seriously, and that you were practicing a lot younger as well. Like, was that coming from family pressure or anything like that? So,
I mean, I think, well, I come from a family that takes music seriously, in the sense of, it's seen as, you should know how it works. You should learn, and you should learn an instrument, and you should take it seriously as an art form, I suppose. No one in my family had done it professionally before me. Actually, having said that, I think my uncle was a music teacher for a bit, but like no one had been a professional musician before me in the family. But it was certainly taken. I was bundled off to music classes by my mum. Yeah, absolutely. But in terms of seeing it as a career, no, absolutely not. And I think my parents were, my family generally were, skeptical, as parents tend to be of such things. But it got to the point where, well, like I said, it was obvious as something which I wanted to do, and then, but it didn't actually coalesce into an actual career until quite a lot later. But I certainly, from a young age, was very into music, generally speaking, and specifically dance music and clubs, and the lifestyle, I suppose, that goes with that. I suppose it's just something which resonated immediately, and I've been doing it ever since.
Sure. I mean, talking about the idea that you were taking it seriously to the point where you were thinking this could be a career, this could be something I could really do something with at a young age, which I think not everybody has those thoughts right off the bat. Do you think that was that just the attraction of the community that you found? Like, I found my thing, I found my people, so I want to figure out how to stay here? Or like, where do you think that comes from?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe I'm kind of overemphasizing the potential that I saw for a career per se, right? I'm not sure if I was, as specific as that. I mean, I think it was, in the first instance, something which was just an environment I really felt comfortable in. Yeah. I think as a kid, that's important when you find that, and I was certainly not I think I was probably a typical music obsessed kid, which is to say that, a lot of the other stuff that around me, I didn't really fit in with, or I didn't feel like I fit in with. And that was, I think that's a really common experience for, young people who really get into music in a serious way. So I think it was probably later that I, really thought about it seriously, in terms of, well, how can I make this something which is, my life as a whole? And You know, I mean, yeah, I suppose because the word kind of career keeps flashing up in my head, and I definitely wasn't thinking about it like that.
Sure.
And the whole notion of having a music career, I think, is something which was, you know, probably relatively recent, you know, in terms of actually where I've actually thought about it. But, well, you know, it was
not to cut you off, but this is something I talk about every once in a while, is that I think from a certain era, you're, I think, probably a couple of years older than me, but we're from around the same time. And at that time, you know, now I think a kid coming up can look to so many examples of a successful music career for dance music or a DJ or producer. And when we were coming up, I mean, you know, there were a few famous DJs and a few, you know, people, I guess, doing it on that level, but it didn't really seem as attainable. Like there wasn't a clear path, at least for me, that I would see, oh, if I just do this and try to get that, then I can get here. And then eventually, you know, you sort of achieve whatever you think success is. Like that just wasn't in my head. I don't think I had much to look at. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a big, big difference between then and now, is that it seems like an obvious career path, I think, for a lot of kids. Certainly the ability for certainly its potential, right, I think is there in a way that it just wasn't. I mean, you kind of understand that, you know, there are people that do it, and therefore, you know, it's sort of theoretically attainable. But I mean, I think the pathways there were like just way more opaque than they are now. And, you know, there's so many, you know, how-to guides, you know, on everything now, including how to be a DJ, how to run a label, how to, you know, make money from music, whatever. Like those things were just not there in the same kind of a way. It was still very much, I mean, the way I thought about it, I remember was, you know, I'd done work in studios when I was in bands, and we'd recorded demos and stuff. And it was still the paradigm of getting a job making the tea in a studio was still there. People still did that. It was like the last probably couple of years of people having the ability to get those kind of jobs. And actually, when we had MJ Cole on my show, that was his route in, right? That was and he told that story, and it was just like that's what he was doing in 1995. It was just like he was making the tea in the studio, and when everyone went home, he would use the equipment, right? But that, I mean, those studios died in the late 90s, and by the early 2000s, they just didn't really exist anymore, certainly nowhere near the same numbers. And so those jobs were just, you know, just disappeared to a large extent. And that was really the only way that I could imagine getting to the place that I wanted to get. Because obviously, I mean, I always wanted to make music. That was the thing. I didn't want to be a DJ, or I certainly didn't see that as some kind of aspirational career path. And actually, you know, a lot of that is because of the way DJing, the perception of DJing has changed over that kind of time. Yeah. I mean, you're right. There were famous DJs. I mean, it certainly wasn't a kind of thing where people didn't think, oh, I'm going to be a DJ in the same way that they do now. So the only way I could imagine at that point of getting to be making records was through that pathway, right? And, you know, it's like, as so many other things did in that era, it just disappeared, right? So you just, I mean, and my, you know, my eventual pathway, like common to so many other people who came up at the same sort of time, just became a complete DIY one, you know? Right. And it was just a question of just like plugging away until it happened, basically.
Well, yeah. And I mean, talking to other people from that era, like MJ Cole was on this show too, and he's such a hero of mine, and a bunch of other people. You know, there was sort of that sweet spot for a while where you could just be putting out your own records, putting out your own vinyl, running your own label, and be making quite a lot of money, you know, and be doing quite well. And as you were saying, that eventually it went away or changed, and it wasn't exactly the same model. Did you get there to the point where you were, you know, whether it was with Hotflush or just you putting out your own records, any of that? Was any of that model still there in terms of like the gold rush of it, or did that miss you?
Well, so we started Hotflush in 2003. It was the 20th year of it. But it was very, very, very niche until, well, what year would I put on it? Probably 2008, 2009. when I say very, very niche, we were, putting out quite a lot of 12s, but really not really aiming to do anything other than break even on each release, right? And we were part of the early dubstep scene, and that was a very, very small scene for the first few years. So it was, I'm not going to say it was a hobby, because it was definitely something which I was going to say big ambitions, but that's definitely not true. I had aspirations for, but those aspirations were not really much more than, selling a couple of thousand instead of 500, on vinyl. Like that was basically the kind of, that was the extent of what I was aiming for. But in terms of and I guess in terms of the way the market developed over that time, we just got the end of the viability of physical products. So then we eventually had a few releases which sold lots and lots on CD and on vinyl. And I guess that was, so we just got a final taster of what had previously been possible on a kind of DIY basis. So yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right to say that there were people doing what we were doing, but just more successful, or releasing music which was more accessible. Yeah, who made loads of money. I mean, it's like the story that I always remember from that era was Wiley apparently selling, north of 100,000 copies of Eskimo out of the back of his car.
It's amazing.
Just driving them around to record shops and just getting through over the course of a few months, just loosing off 100,000 white labels, which is, great.
It's incredible.
Why not?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, I mean, I remember one of the first episodes we did on this show was with Diplo, and he was telling me that, his early career, when he was just slinging mixtapes, like physical CD mixtapes, it was the same thing, just out of the trunk of his car. And, he was basically saying he was inspired by all the Houston rappers who were doing that at the time. And, like the Paul Walls and the Mike Jones of their day. And those guys were, becoming millionaires, just selling out of the trunk of their car. I love thinking about those times, because I'm not one of those people who's stuck in the past, who's like, it was better back in the day. But I do like to think about sort of systems or just cultures that we're not going to have again. Like, I do think there's value in sort of examining those and reflecting on those. And
sure. I mean, like the obvious point there, right, is that if you're selling direct, then you're going to be in a really limited geographic area, right? And most of the time, in fact, probably all of the time, the scenes that give birth to that kind of thing are a very small number of people in quite a confined geographic area, which, incubates and eventually kind of gives birth to this incredible thing, right? And what you're just describing is totally an example of that. And there are numerous examples of it in England in the sort of, from the kind of late 80s, I guess, till the mid 2000s. And I think we have almost entirely lost that now. I think the potential for the confinement of those things, because that's the key thing, right? It's the fact that it can't get out. So it's a small number of people just essentially competing with each other in a completely good-natured way, by the way. Yeah. You have these kind of cultures which emerge where everyone is just trying to do better than the next person who is making this tune. Someone you hear a tune, you think, wow, that's fucking amazing. Your mate makes it and he's like, this is great. And you're like, fuck, this is great. And you get in this, it inspires you to go to the studio and make something better. And that over time can just give birth to this incredible culture, basically.
Yeah.
And incredible music. And I think a key feature of it is the fact that it is confined. So the fact that everything is so disparate now and everything is so kind of spread out, and that brings with it advantages, but I think what you lose there is that are those kind of really kind of close, confined environments.
The petri dish, right?
Right, yeah. Which under the right conditions can and sometimes do, lead to these incredible works of art. if I can put it like that.
Yeah, absolutely, man. I mean, I think, okay, so this is kind of a tangent, but it's related. So I was, you were saying early years of Hotflush, you were focusing on early dubstep, which at the time was a smaller scene. And I was
an example of one of those things. Yeah,
sure.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I was going back. I was listening to your music from around that time, like 05 to 07, and a lot of the singles you were putting out around that time. For anybody listening, there's a great compilation that you put up on Spotify of like the collected music from that time from you. And one thing that struck me, and I'm going to try to connect this back to what we were just talking about a lot of those early tunes from you in that early dubstep style, I was struck by, and I mean this completely complimentary, I was struck by how simple they were. And,
absolutely.
And how rudimentary they were. And there was something, it clicked something in my brain. It made me think about other early scenes and fledgling scenes, like in the US, sort of post US EDM dubstep, there was this whole trap wave where all of a sudden people were making, basically hip hop beats, but with dubstep sounds in them, for lack of that's very simplistic, but that's what it was at the start. And again, a hallmark of that early sound in the US, very simple, sparse production. It wasn't, the engineering wasn't always amazing. The mix wasn't always incredible, but there was this kind of raw energy. And I was struck by that in listening to your early stuff. And my point here is that I think this is maybe another thing that I think we maybe have lost entirely. Like, I don't know that there's going to be another fledgling music scene that starts based off of kind of, for lack of a better word, like amateur production values. And I don't know how I feel about that, because there's something about, even with your early singles, there's this energy there that I think comes from the simplicity of it, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically, I think it's naivety coming through, and that kind of, I suppose, lack of preconceptions can, really be magical. Right. And basically impossible to replicate, because I mean, you're right, because there's so many examples of this in genres of music which emerge in extremely rudimentary form, as you say, and are gradually refined over time. And, people sort of jump on gradually, more and more people get on board, and the styles are kind of whittled down and, ostensibly improved, but quite a lot of the time you lose something along the way.
Yeah.
So you end up with music which is sort of the same, but much more polished. And, some, and there's pros and cons to that, right? Yeah. Absolutely. Always there are. But you can't replicate that kind of wide-eyed, just taking crazy risks, because why not? You've got nothing to lose. Oftentimes you don't have a clue anyway, Yeah, so I'm thinking about, early jungle was like that, early punk. You could basically just name any musical genre, and the early examples of this, they fit that description totally. And I guess this is the nature of well, so I released a podcast yesterday, in fact, where I solo pod where I essentially mouthed off for an hour on the topic of amongst other things, the comparative lack of musical innovation over time, and essentially the process of there being periods of innovation which then give way to what I've just described, basically. So you have a short period of innovation, and then a much, much longer period of refinement, and then eventually repetition. And we find ourselves, I think, largely speaking, in an era where there's been an unusually long period of time since a really fundamental innovation has occurred, basically. Yeah. So what we've got now is lots of really amazing sounding tracks and, you know, really polished artists doing, you know, really sort of lots of cool stuff, don't get me wrong. But it's all refined versions of stuff which was essentially come up with decades ago, mostly, you know? And yeah, that's where we are. And I'm always, when you say these sorts of things as someone who's been around for a while, clearly, like, the obvious response is like, well, why don't you do something which is new and innovative? But it's not that simple, right? It's because musical innovation, look, almost always comes from a confluence of factors and a number of different people working in concert. It's very, very rarely just one person coming up with something.
And I would say it's almost never intentional at the start either.
Right. Yeah, I would totally agree with that too. Oftentimes, a culture which emerges with a very small number of people, but there has to be more than one person usually, right? So it's whether it's I don't know, hip hop in New York or whatever, or punk in New York in the 1970s or whatever, or techno in Detroit, or whatever. These, name your favorite genre of music, and it usually started in one of these situations, right? And like I said, I think we find ourselves in a period where that hasn't happened for a long time. And it's difficult when you're thinking about the reasons for that. It's difficult to look past, well, what's happened, what's been the fundamental change in the last 25, 30 years. I mean, it doesn't take a genius to work it out, right? And I think the fact that the people's contributions have been so spread out, I think has got to be significant in this, right? And the comparative lack of those kind of small confined, if I can just go back to what I was saying before, those small confined, geolocated cultures and scenes. I forgot when you asked me a question, I can't remember what it was. But.
No, I think you pretty much covered it. I mean, it's, and even as we're talking about it, like, I started off saying that I don't know about sort of like the amateur production values being a part of any new scenes. But even as we're talking, made me realize, I think baile funk is having a big moment again. Not that that's a new sound at this point, but it's kind of having a new resurgence. And some of the production there, I would say, is in the most positive way, kind of amateur and full of that, like, just youth energy. So I don't know. I might just be full of shit as far as that goes, because I do think there's innovation happening all the time. And it's sort of, I guess the question really becomes, how much is accepted into mainstream culture, mainstream music culture, and how much is able to sort of survive and not sort of just get ingested and, made generic and commodified and that sort of thing. It's because some of those scenes, they'll pop up quickly, but they get ingested just as quickly, and I think sort of lose their way. They don't keep that, kind of what you were saying. They don't keep the regionality of it, the specificity of it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the question is it innovation or is it refinement, right? Because I think that's a kind of key distinction here. And an existing style of music can be refined in a way which is really cool and interesting.
Yeah.
But does that make it something new? I mean, most of the time, probably not. I'm regularly told about new forms of music that are coming out of various different parts of Africa, right? And that sort of makes sense, because I imagine, and I'm not talking with any authority at all, but music tech becoming available to large groups of people is probably happening in Africa in a way that it happened in the developed world, or whatever the correct term is, 20 years ago or whatever, sure. 25 years ago. And that coincided with, lots of bad music being made, but also, quite a lot of good music being made too. So I can imagine those sorts of developments yielding innovative, quote unquote, innovative stuff, maybe, certainly a lot of cool stuff potentially. But as you said, whether any of that makes it into the kind of wider accepted lexicon, the marketplace, the wider marketplace, because this stuff gets sucked up and commodified and sold back in a way which is deeply depressing, actually, when you think about it. But I think those sorts of commodifying forces, and you can probably link it to corporate marketing departments to a large extent. Those sorts of things, I think, reinforce those existing existing kind of palettes, which are then refined, right? So I think there's a huge amount of the forces there are not pushing in the direction of making quote unquote art. They're making stuff in which they can help to sell products, basically. I mean, that's what those things do, right? So, and that absolutely reinforces those that the tendency to refine rather than to innovate, I think, is a broad statement that I would kind of stand behind.
Yeah. Well, is it odd? I'm sure it is odd for you in some way, but we've been talking about these sort of early days of dubstep, and now it's, especially in the States with the rise of EDM and all that. I mean, even the term dubstep doesn't mean the same thing that it did when you were starting off with Hotflush and all that. And obviously, I'm sure you and everyone else in that scene at the time had no idea of the potential of how far it could go, how it would change, who would, any of that. But is it odd to like reflect back on kind of those early, smaller days and then to see how far it's gotten from where it started? I know that's a broad question, but...
Well, I mean, yes, absolutely. And to put it in perspective, the early dubstep scene was centered around one club night, which was called Forward, and it happened once a month. It started in 2001 as ostensibly a garage night, a sort of crossover garage and breaks and whatever night. And dubstep didn't really transfer into any sort of success until 2006. So there was 5 years, those of us who were involved in that, we spent 5 years standing around once a month, swapping CDs and listening to a small number of DJs play the tunes that we were swapping on CDs.
How many people were in this club?
A tiny number of people. So often 50, 100.
Yeah.
And probably 48 guys.
Right.
A couple of girls, maybe.
Yeah.
Occasionally. In fact, the person who ran the club is a woman. But in terms of the actual crowd, the paying customers, it was heavily weighted towards dudes.
Yeah.
And, it was something which it was a labor of love, I think, is the best way I can describe it. I don't think any of us thought it was ever going to go anywhere. But we continued doing it because we, I guess, loved the music and had a lot of fun participating in the community and, had a lot of fun making the music. And, when you're, when you're making stuff which no one likes, basically, apart from this tiny number of people, hearing your track get played out on the venue was called Plastic People, and it had the best sound system I've ever heard in a small club. It was an F1 rig, but like way too big for the space. Just stupidly over-spec'd. And hearing a track that you've made that week, cut to dub play and played on that system was it didn't get old,
Sure, of course.
At all. It was just extremely fun. And so it sustained for 5 years, and then suddenly the stars aligned and loads of people liked it. And it was the most bizarre turn of events. It was completely strange. I mean,
how did it happen? Was it? There
were kind of two important events which happened within sort of 3 months of each other. So first of all, Marianne Hobbs on BBC Radio 1 did a special basically where she invited, I think it was four of us, not including me, but of the small number of people that were doing this. So they did 3 hours on Radio 1 one Saturday night, which obviously caught the imagination because the 3 months later there was it was the first birthday of DMZ night. So DMZ Digital Mystics had started a monthly. So there was this actually, it wasn't even monthly. It can't have been monthly because I think it must have been quarterly or something. Anyway, it was the first birthday of that night, and instead of the anticipated, I guess, 300 or 400 people, 2,000 people showed up, and they had to move it into a bigger room on the night. And it was just one of those events, one of those turns of, you just thing that you witness, which is so far out of your range of expected outcomes.
Yeah.
Just completely. And like I said, those of us who'd been there for 5 years at that point were just astonished. Because I mean, by early 2006, I mean, I'm slightly exaggerating when I say it was like, 50 people in a room, because what it had coincided with was the internet.
Yeah.
And, there had been people from around the world who had noticed what was going on, because obviously you could buy records online at that point. People were posting radio sets online. So you could, if you were that way inclined, you could find out what was going on for the first time, probably in the emergence of a scene in London. You could find out what was happening via just observing it online. So there were little things going on. There were people turning up. People were flying in to go to the nights, occasionally. I mean, small numbers of people, but it had caught some attention, and it had caught the imagination of a lot of people. And it was quite a wholesome grassroots kind of a scene. Yeah. It was very, very community oriented. If you were into it, then you were immediately best friends with anyone else who was into it, kind of thing. It was just very wholesome is the right word. But by definition, when that expands, like in the immediate term, it's like, yeah, wow, amazing. Our family is now just exponentially bigger. And, you kind of keep that mentality for a bit. Like, just the more the merrier, brilliant. Everyone's on the right kind of track. But then, of course, you can't sustain that. The more people that come into it, the more diluted it gets. And eventually that's, of course, what happened over time. And, certain musical influences came in, which weren't, to everyone's taste, who, we shall not mention many names here, but, that's the nature of success, I guess, like the more mass appeal that you have, the more diluted something tends to become. And, I think particularly with music, when the bigger venue, the bigger the crowd, the bigger the temptation to play to the lowest common denominator,
sure.
Basically, particularly with dance music. And, it just always happens. And it happened with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I'm over on the side that, I like both sides. Like I love the early dubstep, and I was obsessed with all the stuff you guys were doing. For me, it's interesting to think about the idea of something that starts from such a small community, this group of friends, this group of nerds, kind of, right? Just excited.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Excited about this idea that you all shared. And then it gets to be such a huge thing. I don't know. I was talking to Dave Nada. I don't know if you ever met Dave Nada. He created Moombahton, which, was kind of like taking Dutch house and slowing it down and putting some reggaeton rhythms, and ended up being a big trend for a couple of years there.
Yeah, sure.
And got away from him in a way. Like it's sort of what we're talking about with dubstep. When he created it, it was vibier. It was more.
I didn't realize that was traceable back to one person. Really?
Yeah, I have the email when he sent out the first edits. Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. Because Moombahton, the name comes from the Afrojack song Moomba. And he just took that song, slowed it down, put the reggaeton rhythms under it.
Right.
That's where it came from. And
wow. Okay.
Yeah, it's a crazy thing. And hearing him talk about it, he was like, at a certain point, I just didn't own it anymore. He was like, it was kind of like sending kids off to college. It was like, it was way bigger than me,
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Like I said, like when something achieves that sort of mass appeal, then you can't control it anymore. And actually, it's quite funny. A feature of sort of London bass-inflected music scenes prior to this was actually the attempts to keep control of it. So legendarily, with drum and bass, there were like these scene meetings which would happen periodically, which actually we did an episode of my podcast with D-Bridge, and he talked about one of these. which is just mind blowing to me.
So funny.
Because they're attempting to police the BPM at which the tunes are being made, and what samples you could use, and what tunes you were going to play, and all this kind of stuff. Hilarious. And actually, it's funny because there was this week there was a kind of story or a kind of rumor on Twitter about us kind of DJs WhatsApp group and DJs trying to police what records were going to get played. Just the dumbest shit ever, right? But it's so funny that these kind of the attempts to kind of circumvent the inevitable as you said, getting away of what you feel ownership of, I guess, is what it is, right? Because it's slightly traumatizing, actually. When you feel like you've built something, you feel like something which is ownership is the right word, but you feel like you've made a direct contribution to the development of something, and then it gets ruined, or you get these people don't really understand it, and it's just it's a completely understandable reaction, I think. And then the attempts to always completely unsuccessful attempts to police those kinds of those forces like I said, it's an understandable reaction, and whatever.
Oh, of course. And I mean, to turn the lens back on your own career a little bit, it makes me think about so we sort of covered this time, you're in the UK, these nights are going on, it's getting bigger and bigger. At a certain point, you go to Berlin, right? And start living in Berlin and throwing club nights out there at Berghain. And, it becomes kind of a different thing. And for you, I guess I'm just looking for sort of general memories or reflections of that time. Was the move out there a reaction to how big this had gotten and how you saw things changing, or was it more based on a personal thing?
No, it was absolutely a reaction to all that. I really felt alienated, I think, by the way it had developed, and I'm not just talking about outside people coming in, just the way the music had developed, generally speaking, even among my direct peers in it. It had really sort of gone towards this kind of big room, big crowd mentality, which I just didn't like it, I just wasn't in it, and I didn't really want to make that kind of music, and I didn't really fit in with it anymore. It becomes something much different, and I felt like at the same time it had led to me getting paid a lot more for DJing. It's enabled me to quit my day job, so it was a kind of it was a case of rising tide lifts all boats to an extent, but I didn't. It was something where I felt. Alienated is the right word. I didn't feel like it was something I wanted to be involved with anymore. So it was a case of, I can either just jettison everything, which didn't seem like a smart thing to do. But I'd been to Berlin a few times to play, and liked it as a city. It was a very different place back then. This is 2007. So it was a very different place to how it is now. But it had also changed a lot since the wall had come down. So there was, it had been this kind of real, post-industrial wasteland, or just post-war wasteland, because a lot of it hadn't been rebuilt after the Second World War when the wall came down. And they were still gradually putting it back together in 2007. But I thought I was kind of late culturally moving over, because the party scene there had been really big in the 90s, and Richie Hawtin had moved over in sort of 2001, and minimal was a huge thing. And I sort of felt a bit lame moving there in 2007. Obviously, little did I know that actually I was pretty on point moving there. But I definitely felt like, generally speaking, the atmosphere in the city generally was reminiscent of, the atmosphere in the music scene was reminiscent of what I'd liked about London in that sort of pre 2006 kind of a period. So, what I'd liked about my involvement in the music in London. So it was kind of an easy decision to make, and it was much, much cheaper to live there. And I was obviously, as someone who was like new to trying to put food on the table from my, nascent creativity at that point, I was like, well, yeah, if I can cut my living costs in half, then this seems like a good idea too. So yeah, I just moved over really, and without thinking too much about it, in a way that you do when you're in your 20s, it was just kind of like, oh, fuck it, let's do it. And it was a really, really great time, to be there, to be in the city, to be involved in a scene which was really open-minded. So I came over and started, I was still doing bass music stuff, but it was very much there was this kind of crossover scene which had developed where, there was a little bit of techno, a little bit of dubstep, a little bit of, other kind of influences. And people were just interested in what we were doing, which is just it's a nice position to be in, right? And particularly with Berghain, which was a new thing at the time, but was rapidly sort of gaining momentum as an important thing, generally speaking, in the kind of wider sort of dance music ecosystem. And so we had the opportunity to do a night there, which was amazing. Did it for 5 years, doing stuff which was not what they were well known for at all, but they gave us the freedom and to, largely speaking, do what we wanted, and there was an audience for it, So it was very much the kind of, being in the right place at the right time. But obviously that always helps, right? So I was extremely lucky to be able to move from this, situation in the UK and in the scene that I was as a part of, generally speaking, which is just suddenly caught fire in a way which I really didn't like. I was just, extremely lucky to be able to move to this other thing, which was peripheral to it. So just involved enough that I didn't have to completely torch what I'd been doing for the previous 5 years or 6 years at that point, and build on it in a way which is quite cool. Yeah. So it was great.
It makes me, the way you're talking about it, I like, it almost makes me think about sort of alternate realities or like parallel realities where, you almost sort of started a new timeline where, things are familiar, but they go in just a slightly different direction with, the longer you go on, bigger and bigger sort of differences in the results. It's like an A/B, like reference test almost. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I'm, going back to what we were talking about, sort of geolocated scenes and the sort of decreasing importance of them, or the decreasing ability for them to exist. I mean, I just don't know what it would be like now. And obviously, there are distinct music scenes and distinct, I think, particularly club scenes in cities.
Yeah.
There are real differences, right? But I just don't know what it would be like now.
Physical spaces still, I think, can be hugely, hugely defining for scenes and for cities, because you still got to go to the venue to hear it. And the venue with the sound system, the architecture, the people who show up, that I think is still specific to a place.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And, one of the things which is really worrying, actually, one of the trends which is really worrying is how small clubs are getting kind of cut out to a large extent. I think there's been so many closures. Obviously, the pressures around, running costs and the wider, I think, trends in the audience are significant there. But yeah, I mean, smaller venues are just crucial in the development of this kind of stuff, and even larger clubs, because I think the kind of broad the broad move is towards festival type events, right? And the kind of festival ecosystem has just become, it's just wildly successful. There's no other way of putting it, right? It's a huge success story, and if you want to look at it in a positive way, but the unintended consequences that the kind of grassroots stuff is really under pressure, I think, and largely because, like I said, there are running cost issues and there are various other issues which affect it too. But I think the expectations of the audience is really important. And when you take away kids, because I think it's kids that want to go to festivals, when you take them away from the ecosystem of small venues, then it's inevitable that there's going to be huge pressures, right? So yeah, that's something which I really hope changes, or at least develops in a more sustainable direction, to be honest.
It's interesting hearing you say that. I never really thought about this before, but I'm sure you've had this experience as well on tour, where you sometimes you go to the smaller cities, the cities that aren't visited as much. And I would find actually that's where I would find the scenes that still felt like these smaller communities that we're talking about. Because I think in the bigger cities, the opportunities keep growing and growing, and you could go to a festival every weekend, so you don't even need to go to a club. But for the smaller, I wonder, this is totally just me talking out of my ass, but I wonder if some of that innovation that we're waiting on is actually going to come out of, some of these unexpected places, these smaller places where nobody's really paying attention.
I mean, that's absolutely possible. Yeah. And a lot of the time when you go and play in secondary market.
Yeah. Sorry, secondary market.
But you often get the most enthusiastic crowds in those places. People just love the fact that you've turned up to play, right? And some of the time, you get venues which are unusual, because sometimes there are, actually quite often, I think there are buildings which are available, which wouldn't be available in bigger cities, right? So there are, if the people are there if there's a kind of local culture has emerged or endured, which, gives, produces people that want to spend their time doing that stuff, then you definitely do get really interesting spaces and really interesting just kind of musical approaches. And then sometimes, you have the audience too. So I mean, I've had some great experiences playing places which aren't obvious. I mean, I guess the trouble is they're often overlooked just because of their size, right? So we're going back to what we were saying about how maybe things happen but then don't make it in to the kind of wider consciousness because of their relative isolation. I think that's a problem, and probably has been a problem over time. And people move to the city, quote unquote, I guess for a reason.
Sure,
right?
Yeah, and there's like common wisdom. There's pressure if you got to move to the big city if you want to do this seriously. And I always try to push back on that a little bit. Like here in the States, it's always you got to go to LA. You gotta, if you really want to be in it, you got to go to LA. It used to, maybe 10 years ago, it was New York here. But I don't. Sure. I don't really think it's ever actually been true.
Well, I think it's only true to the extent that you're joining one of those scenes, right?
Sure.
Which are sometimes. You have the big business in those cities too, but often there is a kind of the underbelly, and the kind of scenes that we talked about. The kind of the early dance music scenes. And the punk scene, whatever, like those tended to occur, not always, but tended to occur in some of those, one of the two of those, like, important, quote unquote, important places, right? So I guess it's a kind of like there's two sides of it, right? But I mean, at the same time, you couldn't accuse Detroit in the 1980s of being a kind of center of riches and
Yeah. No, I hear you. I mean, I think you can always, you want to dip into those places, but I don't think you have to be there the whole time. I guess that's what I'm trying to say.
Where are you from?
I was born and raised in Minneapolis, and then I've lived all over the country. So I was in San Diego for a long time. I'm in Washington, D.C. right now. And I kind of came up as a DJ in Chicago.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, Chicago is one of those places, isn't it? It's just a deep history of the culture, right?
It's my favorite city in the world. I would go back there in a heartbeat. I love Chicago.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's awesome. I played at Smart Bar relatively recently. It was a lot of fun.
I love Smart Bar, man. I've spent so much time in Smart Bar.
Right. Yeah.
It's awesome. The best. It's the best, man. Did you ever play in U Street Music Hall out here in DC?
Yeah, I have played there. Yes, and it was good. It was fun. I played Flash as well, which is a great little club.
Flash is great too. Yeah. The only reason I asked about U-Haul is because right after we finished talking, I'm going to go have lunch with the guy who used to run U-Haul.
Okay.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's one of those ones we lost in the pandemic. I mean, it shut down.
Oh, is it really?
Yeah.
Okay, that sucks. That really sucks. Well, yeah, I mean, like going back to what I was saying, like, I mean, so many of those places which are so important locally, you know, are going, you know, and like, I'm actually surprised that some of them survived that pandemic period. But I mean, like I said, there are ongoing pressures which are negative for that part of the industry, you know, which sucks.
And it does, man. It does. And and I don't know that I have the solution to it, but I know that it's important to talk about it, you know, and to try to support those places when we find them, because that's where all the culture, all the innovation, all the shit we've been talking about, it all happens in those places, you know?
Yeah. I mean, I would just encourage people to go to small venues, right? And particularly if you're new to going out to this kind of music, you know, because it's all very well going to a festival and it's, you know, this big production and you see all the DJs you want to see and all the rest of it. But like, you know, the real shit is in small venues, you know, where it's dark and you can't take photos really, you know, you can try. I mean, they should be banned, but that's another story. But like, the real shit happens in those places, you know, and they won't be there if people don't go to them. So go to them.
100%, man. 100%. Well, and to kind of start wrapping this up here, I want to make sure to at least honor the 20th anniversary of Hotflush a little more, because I think it's a huge milestone. And you've been putting out all these compilations of, you know, retrospective songs that you've released, new material from artists and yourself who have been putting out music on the label the whole time. And some events as well, right? Is it actually?
Yep.
I should know this, but I don't. Is there a tour in the works?
We have,
or has it happened?
We have finished up what was a tour, and there may be some more dates later in the year. But at the moment, we're kind of done with it. Live wise, anyway. We had some really good shows actually. In fact, the Smart Bar show was one of the dates on the tour.
Nice.
We did that in the States, and then we did Good Room in New York too. But most of it was in Europe. And it was a lot of fun. It was nice to get out on the road with some of the people who, you know, who've released down the years and, you know, haven't released more recently, so haven't been playing out with recently. So, you know, people like Machine Drum and George Fitzgerald, highly enjoyable, basically.
Well, so I was reading some interviews from you, from like old interviews that you did, talking about the label. And one thing you said in a couple different places is that when you started it, you never really expected to make money with it. And so because, and I'm paraphrasing here, this might not be exactly your words, but
that's accurate, but carry on.
Well, okay. So my understanding of what you were saying was, because you sort of in your head never thought that this was going to be a money-making endeavor, that allowed you to operate a little differently and to try things and do things in a way that you might not have otherwise. And I guess my question is, you know, 20 years down the line, a lot of people, I think you're different from a lot of people, because a lot of people, you have a passion project, maybe you don't expect it to make money, but at a certain point you stop doing it. Like what was the 20 years later, like what kept you there? What did you find or rediscover about running that label that, you know, got you to 20 years?
I mean, I just really enjoy the process of looking for music, looking for new music and giving it a platform, really. And it's largely just a fluke that we've amassed a catalog over the course of 20 years, which ticks along and sort of pays the bills. And, you know, there are, obviously there are pressures and the sort of expectation which kind of comes along with being part of a landscape for that long. But I've really tried not to change my approach too much, just because I enjoy that approach, right? I generally, and I've said this a number of times, and I think it's true. I think when I first started saying it was probably trying to justify myself, but I don't try and pick hits necessarily. So when I'm looking for I'm looking for something new, I tend to look for, because we release a lot of new artists, right? A lot of what we put out is people's first releases.
Yeah.
And we don't sign people on long deals. We just try and, identify people who I think have potential. And that's actually to a large extent what a lot of our catalog is. It's music which I think is being made by people who have the potential to do more, right? So I'm not, I don't wait for the big hit. If I see someone with potential and they've made music, obviously it's got to be of a certain standard, clearly. But once I think they're ready to start doing it, I'll just be like, yeah, fucking let's do it. And then sometimes that then leads to, them making the big one, that everyone wants to buy. But, most of the time that doesn't happen, but that's fine. And, we've had lots of people who've come and gone from a label who've gone on to have really good careers. Some people haven't at all. That's also fine. But I just enjoy that process of, I guess, engaging with people and giving them a bit of a platform. And, it's not a business model which is ever gonna grow into a kind of, because there's been various points along the way where I've had a decision to make. Like, do we want to push this and get up to being a much bigger thing? Or do I want to just continue with my, cottage industry way of doing it? And I've always eventually come down on that side of it, just because I know there's so much of almost certainly if I change that approach to try and go down that slight, I mean, it's not even a corporate way, it's just taking the bottom line much more seriously and making that much more of a thing. I know what would happen, it would end up me not enjoying it anymore, basically.
Yeah.
And I just enjoy the process. And I think that's why I'm still doing it. It's because it's basically the same thing that it's always been. And it's also a platform for my music, and it's nice to be able to control what I'm doing, and have control of all my masters and that kind of stuff, which is great. But actually, I think mostly what I enjoy, and the kind of work that I do on a day-to-day basis, the stuff I enjoy the most is finding new stuff. And that's a great feeling, when you find something, and seeing people have a bit of success and being able to contribute to people's careers in that kind of a way is just something I find extremely rewarding, So that's basically why I'm still doing it, because
It's beautiful. No, that's beautiful. And there's a couple things in what you just said. I mean, you started off talking about how sort of the rawness of when you first start producing music, you can never exactly get back to that because, you refine it over time and you lose some of that amateurness, which is good and bad. But I think what you're talking about with the label is maybe a way to emotionally connect with that earlier self, that kid, because that's part of it, right? Is the excitement of hearing a new song and just wanting to know more about it, wanting to be involved. And now you have a vehicle to do that, right? And it's energy that can be put to a purpose that sort of keeps you in that beginner stage, that beginner mindset. And I think that's really valuable in for a lot of ways, in creativity, in terms of just emotionally over a long career, not burning out, in a lot of ways.
Yeah, man. I mean, I hadn't thought about it like that, but I think you're right. Yeah, I think it's a way of, I think part of what I enjoy about it so much is because it's a bit of a window back into that period, back into that kind of healthy naivety, I suppose, that you have when you're first starting out making music. Being able to kind of, I guess, identify potential and, help bring it out, is the stuff which is, as I said, the most rewarding thing that I really do, to be honest. And it doesn't get old at all. It really doesn't. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I would say too, to give you some compliments. I mean, when I think of what you do, there's a high taste level associated with everything you've done. And so I think to lean into that, because I think that truly is a skill of yours. I think it's something that makes you stand out. It's just smart, man. Not only is it something you clearly enjoy, but I think it all plays into your strengths as an artist and as a cultural curator, if I can be that pretentious about it.
Yeah, I mean, you know what? It's funny because the label is so closely associated with me, and which is, it's a blessing and a curse, right? Because I think certainly it would be a curse if I ever wanted to, or if I ever took that decision, right, to go down the other way, right? Because it's almost like it's so much of the kind of quote unquote brand value, air quotes, brand value, is tied up with like the kind of, with myself personally. And I don't know how I would ever disentangle that, how I would ever unpack it from itself. But, but as it stands, it's completely fine, because like, as you said, it's just me picking records. It's just, it's directly analogous to DJing, it's just picking tunes, right?
Of course.
And then, and also people to an extent. And like I said, that's just, it's sort of internally enjoyable, basically.
Yeah.
So,
it makes me think about your output as a producer too. I mean, you've put out a lot of different styles and sounds over your career. And it seems like you find a lot of value in that as well, of, not sticking to any one sound and sort of just whatever's, you tell me if this is wrong, but my impression is like, whatever you're interested in at the time, for whatever reason it catches your ear, it's your perspective on it, right? Like it's your spin on whatever idea you're excited about at the time. And to me, that's the through line of your whole catalog.
Yeah. I mean, that is absolutely it. I would say to anyone listening who's maybe an aspiring producer, this is not a good idea. Like, you shouldn't do this at all. Like, pick a style and stick to that style. Honestly, that's a much better idea. But you're right. I mean, I've never really been sort of squeamish about that. If there is something which takes my fancy, if there's something which really is kind of inspiring me, my approach has always just been to, let's do it and let's release it under the same name, give a fuck, on the same label. And like I said, it's not a smart commercial way of doing it. However, I think if you make that the consistent bit, perversely, like maybe it can just about work, right? And I think that's probably just about what I've managed to do, right? Over the course of this, it's not been without its problems, I have to say, over time. And there's been many people who I've worked with, on the management side and the booking agent side, who've torn their hair out as a result of my release schedule. But it's just who I am, basically. I can't change it, and you can't be anyone other than who you are, basically. Particularly as a musician, you just have to do what you feel is best, basically. So,
I completely agree. And very quickly, just because I have to ask you about it, the Hardcore Heaven EP that you recently put out, that to me, so I started, my love of dance music started with UK hardcore and like happy hardcore.
That's a good place to start.
Oh,
absolutely.
Man, that's where it started for me. So hearing you do that, I was a little blown away, just because I wouldn't have expected to hear it from you, but it's fucking great, man. And like, where does that come from? Was that?
Well, likewise, man. I love that music. I absolutely love it. So, it was just I was just going through a stage of where I was a little bit going around in circles with stuff. And, one day I just sat down and said, what would be the most fun thing to make this morning? Let's make some 92 hardcore. Let's see how it goes. 91 to 93. Let's just plow away on it. And, before I knew it, I had like 20 tracks. And, sometimes that's just how it works, right? Sometimes it just flows. And I absolutely love that music too. I think it's just amazing. It's, absolutely stands the test of time too, like it's
100%, 100%.
So,
yeah, no, there's something crazily timeless about it. And you just said, without me even asking you, a thing I talk about on here all the time, which is, and this is for any producers out there listening, anytime you're stuck, anytime you don't know what direction to do, just ask yourself, what is the most fun choice I could make right now? And that's always going to be the right answer. It's crazy, but it's so simple, but it works 100% of the time.
I absolutely agree. 100% agree. And it's the key, I think, to longevity is finding a way to keep making it fun, right? Or keeping the fun around, because it can so easily feel like a chore, it can so easily feel like work. And the longer you get into it, the longer you go, And the more you're laboring under expectations, that the more potential there is for the fun to be sucked out of it, right? So yeah, it is definitely a trick to acquaint yourself with, right? Just say, no, we're having fun today. We're just having fun.
Yeah, of course. And it's got to be a practice. That's the weird thing, is you almost have to ritualize, you have to practice having fun over a long enough career, right? Because we all lose it, and you always have to find it again, and it's sort of this cycle. But it to me, man, that's always the North Star. Is like anytime I feel lost about it, it's just like, well, let's fuck around, you know?
Yeah, 100% agree.
Man, well, is there? This is really great, man. I really like talking to you. Is there anything we haven't talked about? Anything else on your mind? Anything else you want to get out there before we wrap it up?
I mean, not really. I mean, I would just, I would ask people to go and listen to my podcast, because that's most of what I do these days.
Hey, me too, man. Me too. And yeah, we'll send everybody over there. Not a Diving Podcast. It's really good, man. I've listened to a lot of episodes. I enjoy it a lot. And man, there's so many other things I have on this paper, man, but I would love to come back and do a part 2 sometime, because I feel like we
absolutely, man.
Keep going 100%. For a while. Awesome, man. Well, thanks so much for your time, dude. I appreciate it. This was a lot of fun.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks for having me on. Really enjoyed it.
Absolutely. Thanks, man.